from a seat.
Okay, and we do need to speak into the...
Yes.
I'm about to call this meeting to order. Can we get the image that gets the speaker, please? Thank you.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
Good evening, everybody. This is the May 5th, 2022 public information session in which we are presenting to you the Mansfield Town Council's adopted budget for fiscal 2022 and 2023. I'm Tony Moran. I am the mayor, and I will open tonight's session. And then I will be followed by the chair of our finance committee, Peter Kotchenberger. There will be an opportunity for questions after we make our presentations, but I'm going to ask people to hold their questions until the presentation is completed. We do have some time constraints, and if we can get right through and then take your questions, that will be the most efficient way to do this. This is a very interesting year. For the first time ever that I am aware of, and I've been on the town council since 2009, we have a number of sources of funds that will allow us to do work that we have postponed for a long time and that desperately needs to be done, and also to expand in some ways some of the services which are needed in the town of Mansfield. Tonight we're going to present to you our budget on the basis of which we raise property taxes, personal property taxes, and other taxes in town. But there are other pockets of money which I would like to tell you about in advance because we have a very unusual situation. This year, several things have happened. First of all, everybody knows we've been through a pandemic, and we have been granted by the federal $5 million in ARPA money which has to be spent over the next several years. In that money, out of that money, we are beginning to do a number of projects, some of which have to do with improving facilities, making them safer, and upgrading some areas that hadn't been upgraded before, particularly around air circulation and public health and public safety. In addition, we have received a $4.5 million grant for the purposes of improving South Eagleville Road, contributing to the development of an affordable housing project on South Eagleville Road, and also expanding public sewers in that area, which with for some hope might actually lead to some senior housing. We have also received an $830,000 grant from the state to do very major repairs on the two older town halls, the 1840s Town Hall and the 1930s Town Hall at the top of Spring Hill. Both of those buildings house our historical society and their remarkable collections. Both buildings are being seriously damaged by water problems as well as lack of maintenance over the years. So we will be able to restore those buildings at least to a safe condition and to make them more accessible to the public. In addition to those pots of money, last year the General Assembly approved a new formula for funding pilot under which the town of Mansfield receives a very substantial increase in funding. Now, when we did our budget last year, it was while the session was still in session, while the legislature was still in session, and we weren't certain about the amount of money that we were going to get. So we only budgeted for $800,000 of that. And in fact, we received a much more substantial amount of money. I think it's about $4 million for that grant. So we did not appropriate money out of that pot of money because we didn't know whether it was going to be there or not. But there is money left that we can spend this year. So you can see we have projects that are specifically limited to certain uses. There are grant funding with very specific requirements. And in addition, we have some large amounts of money that can be used at our discretion for improving public services and improving particularly public projects. One of the council's major objectives this year has been to do very serious increases in road repair, and much of this money is being directed in that area. The town charter allows the council to reallocate money between accounts as long as it doesn't come from the property tax revenue. So if it is state funding or federal funding, we can move that money around without having a town meeting or a referendum. And we have been using that opportunity to fill some very real needs in this community. Some of that has already been discussed in public session in the town council. Much of it is available for you to see online. So to begin with, the budget that we are going to present tonight, you have to see against the background that there is more money and there are other projects and there's more allocation to come. For example, at our next council meeting, on the agenda is the creation of a fund to support small businesses in town who have been harmed by the pandemic. In addition, there is a proposal to move some of the money from from the current year's pilot money into road repair, and also if those of you who travel on Hunting Lodge Road between Separatist Road and North Eagleville Road know that the road is closed. We've had a culvert collapse, and the repair of that road is going to be very expensive, over $400,000, and that will come out of some of that money as well. So if your favorite project isn't included in the budget that's being presented tonight, it doesn't mean that we aren't funding it. It just means it may come from a different pot of money. So let me begin by saying that as the council, and this budget is very similar to what the town manager proposed, and his guiding values and principles are what the council was also guided by. Before I move off that last set of alternate pots of money, I do want to say that without the support of our state legislators, Greg Haddad, Brian Smith in the House, and May Flexer in the Senate, much of this would not have come to pass. And without the support of our federal representatives, Joe Courtney, and our two senators, Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal, more money would not have come to pass. And also, I really need to thank the governor for his support to the town over the past year over a number of issues, some of which you will see in the budget, in these budget allocations, but others of which are in other areas. So here are our guiding principles. They are based on the principles that were established in Mansfield Tomorrow, which is the town's vision document and also our document of planning and development. And you can see they're wide-ranging and diverse. Most people don't understand what local government does, and I just want to give you a heads up on some of the things that we do. We have a staff of about 140 people in town hall. Our town funding, our school funding, education funding is about 60% of the budget. But here are the other things that we do. We do everything from marriage and death certificates to highways and sewer systems, from schools to social services. Many of you know our library, which has a very strong history of public service, and also our health system and recreation. This has been a very interesting year, and we have accomplished a great deal. We have a stable tax rate for the past 3 years. We have a goal of increasing our fund balance account, and Mr. Kotchenberger will talk more about that. We, of course, have had a very comprehensive response to COVID-19. Here we need to also thank the university because its requirement that everybody who is on campus be fully vaccinated has helped keep Mansfield safe. Don't believe the data you read in the newspapers. We are one of the most heavily vaccinated communities in the state. In addition, we have initiated, or our town manager has initiated, a local government academy, a 10-week program in which members of the public learned about local government in depth. We are also doing, have been focusing on open communications to the public, and you will see that through our new electronic newsletter and other changes as we go along. Planning and development. This has been an area that has been very difficult over the past year. As you may recall, we've had some conflict with our neighboring institution, but at the moment we are moving ahead with real affordable housing as well as other multifamily housing projects that are underway. Everybody is waiting to see the new school, and it will be opening sometime this fall. We're not quite sure when. Everybody understands that construction is difficult these days, as it always is difficult, but it's particularly difficult during a pandemic. We've also been moving ahead on sustainability. You may remember that we are a silver town. We're aiming for gold this year, so we'll see if we get there. And we're also working on finding ways of making our Parks and Recreation program financially sustainable. If you've driven by the community center, you know that we have a new Martin Luther King mural. It's just one element of our emphasis on human rights and diversity project, which is near and dear to the council's heart. We have been working on expending the money from the American Rescue Plan, and some of it is going to go to local business. Some of it has been, some of it is being spent on maintaining the best quality of municipal services, and particularly around touchless use of town services. We've begun to look at the very real problem we have of aging and inadequate town buildings, and this is one you have to stay tuned for because there's a lot more to come. Infrastructure needs, as I said, this budget really looks at putting some additional support into infrastructure, particularly into roads and water and stormwater drainage. Okay, affordable housing, new elementary school, diversity. Now, I'm going to do a spoiler. This budget calls for not only some noteworthy enhancements, but also we will be decreasing the mill rate by 1 full mill. And we can only do that thanks to the state legislature's new formula for calculating pilot funds. So with that, I am going to turn this presentation over to Peter Kotchenberger, who is chair of our Finance Committee, who will lead you through the numbers of the budget itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for watching and for participating. I'm going to just move, we wanted to leave time for questions, because that's one of the major parts here. So I'm certainly not going to go over every slide, but we'll go over and highlight the important ones and the ones most relevant for tonight. But these documents, these slides and the many, many supporting documents, including the entire proposed budget, which is about this big, is available online and has been for a while. And thanks to the town manager and town finance manager. So a budget is, to summarize, I think I was thinking of it as two things. First, it provides an overview. What's important to our town, and how do we realize that, or make what are our priorities and our values? How do we make them real, concrete? How do we implement them? In that sense, it's a very important public policy document, but it's also a financial blueprint. Once the budget is set at the town meeting, it's not set ultimately by us, it's set by the town itself, all of us. Once the budget is set, it is not simply, it's not a list of goals or stakeholder views. It is the financial blueprint, meaning this is the budget that we will then use and will be how we operate. We, the town and the schools, operate for the next fiscal year. Any changes, they're hopefully few, and they are made consistent with the rules that the mayor said a few minutes ago. These coincide, and is somewhat similar in a way to what the town's overall objectives are, which the budget is perhaps what may be the major way in which we, again, make those objectives true or come to pass. And these are the objectives we've had. These are not particularly new. What we do have, however, is this year and to some extent next year, we have some unusual opportunities because of the additional funding that that the mayor mentioned earlier. We have some opportunities to go beyond what we otherwise could do and still not only maintain the current mill rate, but actually lower it. This is a very broad snapshot. Much of the rest of the presentation and our discussion tonight will really just drill down on these various aspects. The town in Mansfield Public Schools, as you can see, is about a little over four times, or roughly 80%, 85% of the total budget. The Region 19 contribution, which is now set, it's a contribution in name only. We are required to provide the amount that is set, and we, of course, have done so every year. And then we have the three different funds, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes. These are the revenues, and this is independent, again, from the ARPA money and other funds from, including pilot and other funds that Mayor mentioned, some of which are reoccurring, pilot, and others which represent, including such as ARPA, which represent a 1 or 2 year period of getting the revenue and then several years to spend it. But this talks about, these are the revenues that we receive every year, although of course the amounts differ. And then there's simply another chart that shows this as a pie chart. And as you can see, and this is, taxes comprise 36 million and change, to use the term loosely. But intergovernmental has always been very important for Mansfield, and it has increased. So of the intergovernmental, it's largely two state grants. One is the pilot grant at 13.1 million, and the second is the educational cost sharing grant, which this year is slightly under 9.5 million. So every town has some reliance on statewide revenue. Our educational cost sharing grant is part of that, but the significant increase in pilot for Mansfield and several towns where so much of the property is owned by government is an increase, and one that we hadn't seen until a couple years ago. And this simply shows a percentage of how much of our budget, how much of our revenue, rather, comes from taxes, what we all pay as residents from taxes, and how much comes from state aid. And then there's always a third category, fees, but primarily it is, and as you can see, taxes range from 60 to 64, 65% of the total revenue, with the rest pilot, largely pilot, and the state education equalization grant. Okay. Revenues, this shows simply the breakdown, in part, this is this initially is the grand list, which is the basis of how the various taxes are calculated, and as real estate, which is the one for most of us, is by far the most significant. There's also personal property, and then there's motor vehicle. And there has been, a growth, not surprisingly, in the grand list. The three in real estate, the change of $3.3 million largely has to do with reassessments on commercial property. It does not reflect a decrease in personal homes, residential property. Grand list has grown modestly. This goes from 2010. We, of course, have information, if people want it, that goes back far, more years. Intergovernmental, again, is essentially money from other sources. As we talked about, we have enhanced pilot funding, which 2 years ago has increased our pilot amount from approximately 8.2 million, which was the amount it was several years ago, now to 13 million. All pilot funding is statutory, so it's of course vulnerable to being changed, but this is an enhancement that has been now for 2 years, and we're optimistic that it will stick around. Educational cost sharing grant has been around much longer, and of course it's also has a statutory basis. And this shows the how pilot, actual versus the estimated pilot payment, and it shouldn't surprise people that the yellow, except for maybe 2020, 2021, 22, we were underfunded, and so was every other town. The pilot enhancement, which I think 4 or 5 towns, including Mansfield, has made a significant difference and funded pilot up to what the statute says. So now we'll break down the budget. The reduction the mayor announced, $1 million. We are not sustaining services. We are, well, in some sense we are, but we're also significantly enhancing them in various areas. And those include the description there, public works, safe roads, safety, more firemen, and a new, paying for another residential trooper. And then other highlights, we have labor negotiated obligations such as, well, salaries and benefits. Some of these are not discretionary. Of course, once a salary has been, and benefits have been negotiated, it's no longer discretionary. And some of these are dictated by the state, such as the Municipal Employee Retirement Program. The pay-as-you-go capital plan, just to talk about that very briefly, is that's something that we, in the sense of a council maybe 10 years ago, thought was very important. And that was to, instead of bonding, which has its own costs, for mid-level, for equipment or somewhat low-level expenses, more than 20 or 30,000, but not 500,000 or a million. In order to do that, we would pay for that out of the general revenue and not bond for it. And that means that can slow down at times some of the purchases, but it also means that we are not incurring interest debt. We're paying for these things when we have saved sufficient money to do so. These are the budget drivers. In other words, what has increased particularly over the last year. Debt service, we'll talk about it in a few minutes. That, as everyone expected, once we've started debt servicing for the school. Once that happens, that has increased our debt service. This is the amount of debt we owe, largely through bonding, and our percentage is significantly below what is recommended, the maximum level recommended, and we'll show that in a minute. Here are the expenditures through the pie chart. As you can see, if you combine Mansfield schools, K through 8, plus Region 19, of which we're one of 3 towns, then we have, and this is consistent more or less every year, we have about 2/3 or a little less than 2/3 of this town's general fund expenditures go into education. Then the percentage changes somewhat, but this is largely the case. This percentage, or the fact that most of our expenditures, revenues go to pay for the schools by itself, I think is the norm in Connecticut. However, the amount is somewhat higher. And I think this demonstrates quite clearly one way of demonstrating the town's traditional and current commitment to education. The general government, which is other offices, as you can see, is a relatively small percent, 4%. And then after the schools, high school as well as the middle, the town's public schools, the next largest, here the dark green, is other uses, and we can talk about that. And this is townwide. Okay, the general fund is where the large amount of money, almost all of it, goes into, and from which the expenses are paid. There are statutory requirements and accounting requirements and how it's met. Every town is audited in several different ways annually. We had the annual audit last month and came back entirely clean, which is a tribute to our finance department and the town itself. These are where, as we talked about cost drivers, where we see, these are not, of course, the total amounts. This is where the increases from previous fiscal year. Salary and benefits. Healthcare costs is more expensive. That shouldn't surprise anyone. The debt service is increased because we're now starting to pay for the school and for the new school, and then our energy has gone up, and I'm frankly a little surprised it's not a little more, but we may unfortunately see that through the next fiscal year. And then, and this is very important. This is the increases, but what are we going to do in terms of enhancing services? And the benefits, the wages, what we pay on debt, that's mandatory once we agree to incur cost. These are what we're doing with, as the mayor mentioned, with both some of our, the town's tax money, but also, as well as public, but also the ARPA funds and other funds. And this includes additional staffing, not only, but for firemen, the trooper, still very modest, but we are contributing to area agencies, and this is a recognition that there are nonprofit agencies, particularly in the Wyndham area, but elsewhere, that provide services to Mansfield residents that we do not, and that, while we're not statutorily obligated to pay contributions, it's important to do so, particularly in light of COVID, because that's how they rely and can provide these services. MERS is the Municipal Employee Retirement System. The town agreed to participate in MERS quite a while ago. Once that commitment is made, it is not impossible, but very difficult to disentangle, and nor would it necessarily, I don't think it would be good public policy to do so, but it is expensive. MERS, I think, has had a better history than the state pension plan, at least the older plan, in that it's more funded, but there still have been shortfalls, and the amount has gone up. This is not driven by increased retirement benefits, but to fully fund the benefits that have been guaranteed. We can see others. The total proposed, the $400,000, that's the total of increases. Increase in contingency being money that is not specifically set aside for, a cost that we know will occur for a program. But and we can answer questions about that. So the Mansfield Public Schools annual operating budget is decreased, and the services or the quality of education, I feel confident in saying, has not. And this, of course, is a tribute to everyone in the town, but also particularly the schools and the Board of Education, led by Kathy Ward. And some of this, such as outplaced tuition, is we don't have a whole lot of control either way about people, the need to pay this or to and how much. But others, such as energy savings, as anticipated, employee benefits, in part, are a reduction. These reductions are possible, and these are simply the start of the reductions because of the overall town's decision several years ago to build one new school and to close the 3 existing grammar schools. And this was, some of these benefits were specifically described before, and they're starting to come true. Doesn't mean they will remain in the future, but that is, I think, the best guess. And of course, some like the energy savings should increase since we're not in the new school yet, and we're still paying the energy costs of the 3 existing. So fund balance. The town manager, the mayor, may look at me askance. It's to some extent a rainy day fund, in the sense of it's money that is not specifically allocated yet. It is not a rainy day fund, however, in that it just sits there, doesn't accumulate interest, or that it can be used for anything anyone wants. That is definitely not the case. The fund balance is money both, in the sense of hedging. It's like most of us try to do as individuals and families and businesses do, hedging against future need. We all hope, of course, that the 2007-2008 financial crisis does not repeat, but there is a classic case of fiscal contingencies or fiscal crisis in the state, and we were able to monitor, to manage it, in part, manage it better than some. And in addition to an amount that we specifically allocate, surplus revenues, anything that's not spent, because people, salaries can change, people leave, they're not immediately replaced, and salary levels change, go up or down, depending on the job and who holds it. And the other advantage, or one of the other benefits of the fund balance is that it reduces the town's cost to borrow. And that's particularly important now because for the school, we are borrowing more than we've borrowed in many years. So the higher, and it depends on the percentage, the higher the percentage, and now I think what we just see, we're at 17%, the higher the fund balance, it's not a direct relationship because well, the lower our interest rates are charged to us when we borrow. There's obviously other elements involved in setting the interest rates that we pay when we go to the private sector for money, but having a good fund balance is important. And this is one of the things I think the town council over years can be proud of, Democrat and Republican, and the town staff, which is, as you can see, in 2009, we were at 4.2%. It was not insignificant, but it was far lower than it was comfortable and would cost us some in borrowing. And in part, this is when we say this every year because it's true. Bill Ryan, a former councilman and who sadly passed away several years ago, he made it his mission to convince the town council, and he did, of the importance of increasing this, and there's been a steady increase up to 17.2, which is, we don't have a specific target of 20% or anything, but this is a very healthy balance and one that's grown over the last 10 years. This is another breakdown of where the service improvements, largely, not exclusively, largely related to hiring. Okay, so budget drivers, so capital projects, and the mayor talked about this right up front, and this is where some of the other pots of money, the ones for ARPA and others, but where some of those funds will be used. We know the roads are a problem, and we're not going to get to every road next year, of course, and we're not going to get to every road within the next 2 years. But what we are doing is significantly improving the pace of reconstruction, maintenance, and while it gets changed, it's obviously subject to change. On the town website under Public Works, there's a list of road priorities that gives us some sense, or gives all of us some sense of when the road we live on, the street we live on, is tentatively scheduled for repaving or whatever the work is. Other drivers, and this is something that we will be an issue, not only in the next year or two, but for years, is that we've gotten good use out of many of our buildings. And as you can see, they're also, anyone who's been to some of them, they're old. They weren't designed initially for the purposes they have. We've used them well, I think, but they also need to be replaced. Ultimately, that provides a number of benefits and savings, but it also will be expensive. And these are the various investments in capital improvement projects. And this is simply, we look at this is a pie chart of where, of some of what we discussed before. Okay, where does the capital fund go? And I think it's, this is not, I think, a particularly user-friendly part of the budget, or what's required, and that is, so we have the general fund where most of the revenue goes and out of which we pay, the town pays most of its cost. The capital fund is as it sounds. The capital fund is the reserve, or the money that's put in there that will then be funded for capital, which are typically non-reoccurring, not all, but most funds, whether it's the purchase of a fire truck, which is large, or significant road improvements, but funds that will be used somewhat for one or two, not as a source of expense that is every year. So they're not used for salaries or supplies or anything like that. The capital non-reoccurring fund is required, every time we're required to have it by state law. And in essence, what the capital non-recurring fund, because we're not going to, the term itself is not particularly helpful. It's the bucket, in essence. It's where money set aside in the general fund for the capital fund, largely, where money set aside for future capital revenue, it's put in there and then paid out. And one of the reasons for this is that capital costs are not usually paid all at once. You may pay, so for example, the school or improved roads. But major sources of funding are often paid out over time, sometimes years, depending on the expenditure. And this is the bucket in which those committed funds are placed before they're transferred and the amount actually paid to for the good of service we're getting. And that's so the sources of funding for the capital. So the general, we allocate a specific amount of money subject to town approval from the capital non-reoccurring, for capital funds. And we do this in large part, most of it, 82%, comes from money that the general fund revenue sends to capital fund, but it does through this pass-through mechanism of the non-reoccurring fund, which again is the bucket that holds previously approved capital funds. They're transferred from revenue and been approved until they actually are spent on the capital projects that, that have been approved. And this shows where the capital fund expenditures are proposed to go this year. And as the mayor noted, much of it is for public works, much of it is for road maintenance, road improvement, and that includes drainage and other highway road improvements. Just to remind people, none of this is the operating expenses. These are the enhancements, the large enhancements, or things that are going through this year. So, general fund contribution. This is another way of looking at most of the money, the large percentage of money that is available to use for capital funds, capital projects, comes from simply the general fund. The town manager proposes, the town council decides what it's going to recommend to the town, and that amount of contribution for capital costs is then set aside from the revenue, from the general fund, and most of it, and put into the non-reoccurring fund until it's spent within the capital fund. In other words, much of these two funds, capital and the non-reoccurring fund, are funds designed to have the money, hold the money that has been authorized by the town to use for specific capital projects. And here's a more granular breakdown of some of the major projects. Again, the public works being by far the largest amount. As you can see, much of it, not road drainage and resurfacing, is roughly 60% of the total, and some of these projects such as culverts and drainage also directly improve, and guide rails and bridges directly improve the roads as well. Now, there's a note here, and it's always good to read the small print, although not all the time. We don't always have time for it. But this is important because some of this is, as the mayor mentioned, we had excess pilot funds. We budgeted very conservatively on what our pilot grant would be last year for this current year because it was uncertain. And we received much more than that. And that money, some of that money, $700,000, is going to be used to cover increased road reconstruction. And here is a list of the projects that the capital fund that has been approved by the town council, subject, of course, overall to what the budget itself by the town. And then we go into specific uses, public safety. And again, this does not reflect any salaries or benefits. This is additions for equipment here, largely, as you can see. We'll talk in a minute, just very briefly, about Parks and Recreation, because as people know that, in part, largely because of the Silver Sneakers program, and which has obviously benefits to residents and also significant costs to the town, to the Mansfield Community Center, as well as COVID, which, at least for the first year, greatly reduced in the country, anyone's use of these, of centers or gyms, it has not been able to be self-sustaining or near to it. And that has been, debated and explored at numerous council meetings over the last couple of years, and the decision has been made consistently to fund this deficit. This will not be a continuing deficit. It has been one for the last couple of years, and one that is already slightly is less now than it has been, in part because people are returning to the MCC, and also because, and these we'll see benefits of later, because of initiatives to address the cash flow problem that the Silver Sneakers program has, and as well as to enhance community participation, enrollment. So this summarizes, especially, this talks about, again, the parks and recreation. And we have, we have, over the last couple of years, given, through various means, money, money from the guarantee fund to make sure that the community center, especially during COVID, can continue to operate and provide these services. I mean, for many of the, whether the community center itself or much of the work they do outside was particularly outside, was the only form of recreation thought safe or exercise, for the first year or so, and this had costs and less revenue. And so we picked up those costs largely through the general fund for the last couple years. Debt service. This is what we borrow. There, as we'll see in a second, there's a big uptick in the previous from with the start of the starting to pay the debt on the new school, and we also, and how much and where and how is all to be determined. But we also, as we talked about, are going to have to build or either rehabilitate and or build new some of the town facilities. And that will, that will cost money. Here you can see the debt service. And this spike is largely the new school. One of the reasons. What? And the middle school roof. Yeah, and the middle school roof. So, and one of the reasons why we consistently moved to a pay-as-you-go program earlier on, as well as to, as to be conservative in how we spent and how we borrowed, was to be able in the future to be able to borrow money at a good rate and not to have a high debt service compared to overall revenue. And where we are, even with this, is annual debt service. It's hard to read, but annual debt service costs projected less than 4% of the overall operation budgets. That's what we estimate for Mansfield. The recommendation is for generally for municipalities is that it be under 10% of annual operating budget, so we're less than half of the recommended maximum. And this shows, what's increasing things as well. What are other budget drivers? This will surprise no one because unfortunately we're all paying for it now in a variety of ways. Here's what the budget means ultimately, the one we propose and the one that at the town meeting will hopefully be approved or modified, but we'll have a town budget. And this is a decrease, and the annual decrease projected for the median home, which is, you can see, close to $160,000, is a decrease of $160. And then you can see the monthly. And this result would result in a decrease of $1 million. This is simple. This is a summary of where this money goes. We talked about there's some more detail a few minutes ago, but this again is another summary. And how do we compare to other towns? And the answer, and this is based on 2022 fiscal year. So it's apples to apples, and we are essentially the second lowest mill rate. Wellington has slightly lower, Our average, we're at 31.38 for last year, and the town average, the comparable town is 4 points above that. Coventry is sort of neck and neck. And then just the summary. We're reducing taxes modestly. We are enhancing services where it needs to be enhanced and should be enhanced. For example, firefighters to improve response time, which is always a concern. And Mansfield, like virtually every other town in the country, as we understand, that have volunteer departments, the ability to volunteer is much more difficult to get volunteers because of the commitments. So we increasingly rely, yes, absolutely on volunteers, but also on a full-time professional fire force. And we're increasing that to improve, staffing, which ultimately improves public safety. This doesn't say enough. I've been, both the mayor and I and others, we've done this for a while. And this has been, the last couple of years have been extraordinarily difficult for everyone in town. It's difficult for government, in part because the money, particularly early on, is less and the demands more. And the ability to just not only the detail and attention, but the careful, in my opinion, and you get to decide yourself, attention to the detail and this, how we've been able to balance enhancements with, with a tax cut and not committing to future long-term projects that we otherwise don't know where we're going to fund. This is a real tribute to the town staff, particularly the town finance manager, the town finance director, her team, the town manager and theirs, and the department heads. So I want to thank them very much.
So that concludes our formal presentation. Do we have any questions from members of the public? Mr. Aylesworth.
We did not receive any questions ahead of time. I just checked the participants list. I believe the only participants that are logged in virtually right now are municipal staff, and the only people in the room at the moment are the fire chief and another member of the town council.
So the next step in the budget process is the town meeting, which is on Tuesday, May 10th at the Mansfield Middle School, starting at 7 o'clock. We strongly urge members of the public to join us, to participate, to ask questions. This is a kind of an archaic procedure, having a town meeting, but it does provide the one opportunity that, well, not one, because we've already had several, but an important opportunity for members of the public to hear the entire information about the entire budget and to ask questions and get explanations. I know that over the years that I've been on council, there have been serious questions about things that we were able to explain, and by explaining, the public can understand the mental processes that lead the council into making certain decisions. Now, there's always disagreement on some of the items in the budget. Some of us have different preferences and different values. But the budget that we are bringing to you is adopted by 8 out of 9 council members. It is a bipartisan budget, and I would hope that we have your support, but if you have any questions at all, and also if you would like to show your support for the council, for its various members, this is your opportunity. So we urge you to attend, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.